All right, everybody. We can get started now. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Tsujimoto Perspectives in Global Development Seminar Series. Before I introduce our speaker today, let me just put a plug in to say that this seminar today is co-sponsored with the Institute for African Development. Our speaker today will be speaking today at a colloquium, IID organized colloquium called Traveling Further Together, Social Mobility and Class in Urban Africa 2025. And this event is going to be held in 160 Man Library from 3 to 4:30 p.m. So right here in this building, if you want to hear more from the speaker, and there's a couple of people who are coming as part of this colloquium, I do encourage you to attend that event. It's going to be fun and exciting. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Professor Ryan Calder is an associate professor of sociology and director for the program in Islamic studies at Johns Hopkins University. He studies moral conundrums and ethical debates that arise when new markets and industries are born or existing ones change suddenly. He's got a very fascinating range of research topics, and I'll allow him to actually tell us how he comes up with those. He's currently pursuing one project on frequent flyer miles and the financialization of travel, another one on Saudi Arabia in the age of climate change and unprecedented domestic social reform, another one on the collaboration of the anti-woke right-wing platforms for e-commerce and digital payment. And he's going to be speaking to us today from his brand new book on the paradox of Islamic finance. I'm quite excited to hear from our speaker. Please help me welcome Professor Calder.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So thank you to Professor Mabaya, to Aya, to Anna, to everyone who kindly made this talk possible. Let's see, my mic, everything sounds good? Okay, so this is not the cover to my book. This is the hackiest, most obviously AI-generated image that I could find when I entered AI into Google image search. But today I'm going to talk a bit about Islamic finance. Now, has anyone heard of Islamic finance? Raise your hand if you've heard of Islamic finance. Raise your hand if you feel you have a pretty good sense of what it is. Good. Okay, we have some people here. Wonderful, who are more familiar, but sounds like a majority might not be so sure. Well, I'll give you my thoughts on what it may be and hopefully what's interesting about it. So to start with, how did I come to this Islamic finance business? I'm not Muslim, actually. I grew up in the United States. I'm half Japanese, but I was working many moons ago as a management consultant in Saudi Arabia. And my client was the largest bank at the time in Saudi Arabia. And my job was to figure out how profitable every single one of their 10 million customers was. I was known as the Excel monkey on the team. And everything was going great, except I noticed that there was one customer with over 1 billion Saudi riyals in a non-interest-bearing account. Okay, now that's the equivalent of a checking account. Now, most of us keep money in our checking account, like if we're going to use it for shopping, or maybe we have some purchases we need to make. But I thought, there must be something wrong with my data, because nobody keeps it was 4 billion Saudi riyals, so over $1 billion US, right? Nobody keeps that much money in a checking account. Like, what kind of groceries are you buying, right? So this is the building where I was. It's right on the Corniche in Jeddah by the Red Sea. And I went up to the 17th floor where there was a guy named Faisal who was an executive at the bank, and he always knew the answers to things. So I said, Faisal, Mr. Faisal, what's wrong with my data? Is it bad? He said, no. I said, but what's up with this one person who has 4 billion riyals in a non-interest-bearing account? He goes, well, that's the king. I said, you mean like King Fahd, the king of Saudi Arabia? And I immediately felt like an idiot, because what other king would we have been talking about? He goes, yeah. And I said, well, what's the deal? And I'm thinking to myself, like, does he just need money to buy a lot of palaces, chateaus in, the south of France? Does he have like a really high grocery bill? And he goes, no, like it has to do with religion, with Islam. I didn't know anything about Islamic finance at the time. I said, okay. But I knew that Faisal, he's very polite, but he's also very busy. So when he gave really short answers, that means it's your time to leave. So I left. And then I spent the next, 2 decades thinking about Islamic finance and what the deal was with it. Anyway, that's the late King Fahd, owner of a really big current account, checking account. So I ended up writing a book on this topic, available at a soulless Amazon warehouse near you. And I'm going to talk about some of the basics of Islamic finance. I'm going to argue that there are these two paradoxes that kind of make the industry interesting. Now, I could have called the book The Two Paradoxes of Islamic Finance, but that's a crappy title, said my editors, so I just called it One Paradox. Just say a quick bit about my methods. And then I'm going to argue, the main argument of today's talk is that there are these people known as Sharia scholars. They are experts in Islamic law. They're kind of like law professors of religious law. They're academics. They're not, for example, imams or people like pastors. They're really more like, intellectuals, experts in the law who spend decades training in it. And I'm going to argue that they're the ones who resolve these two paradoxes I'm going to talk about. Now, and then I'll close with a look to the future, hopefully. So what are these two paradoxes? What's paradoxical about Islamic finance? Well, one thing is that the Islamic finance industry, in terms of assets worldwide, is worth about $4 trillion, which is a big number. There is no comparably large Christian finance industry or Hindu finance industry or Jewish finance industry or Buddhist finance industry. There are certainly some efforts to develop religious finance of those sorts, but what's the deal with Islam? Why is there a $4 trillion Islamic finance industry? Is Islam somehow like more compatible with capitalist finance than any other religion? And the second paradox, and I'm going to have to explain a bit for you to understand why this is a paradox, but it turns out that the way the industry works today, most of what is done simulates the economic effect of interest. Now, the basic rule of the Islamic finance industry, there are many, but the most important one is that you can't deal in interest. You can't charge interest, and you can't accept interest. And I will show you that today, the way most Islamic banks and financial institutions work, they effectively get around that. But they effectively, from an economic perspective, do what an economist would say is like charging interest. This is not a secret. They say this very openly. So then why is it that hundreds of millions of Muslims, many of whom have concerns about interest, are patronizing this industry? That's the second paradox. And again, in both cases, I argue that it's these special people, these Sharia scholars, who make it work. Okay, so just for a bit about the basics of Islamic finance. What is it? Well, broadly speaking, we could say that Islamic finance is like any kind of financial transaction that someone Muslim deems as being in consonance with her, their, his religion. Right? This is a very capacious definition, but since the 1970s, there has been an industry that people call Islamic finance. And so this is a much narrower, much more sort of real-world definition, and I'm going to focus on this industry. Now, this industry operates by a few rules. I should make very clear that many Muslims do not necessarily adhere to these rules. There are many Muslims who, for example, use credit cards or take out regular mortgages or keep the money in the bank and earn interest. But there are quite a few also who feel uncomfortable with interest. Now, what are the rules by which the industry operates today? One is, as I said, avoidance of interest. Two is that there are certain sectors that Islamic financial institutions, Islamic banks can't finance. They can't provide money for. Not too hard to guess what they are, things like alcohol, pork, but also gambling, also weapons, tobacco. An Islamic bank can't lend money to a regular interest-bearing bank. They call them conventional. Okay. Certain forms of entertainment. Stocks, however, are okay for the most part, as long as you're not investing in, say, Anheuser-Busch or Bank of America or something. Right? So these religious scholars say that stock investing is okay, but investing in, say, regular bonds is not okay, because bonds involve interest, whereas stocks do not. And then finally, there's this really gray area for derivatives. I'm not going to get too much into that today. Derivatives are financial instruments that involve the buying and selling of risk. Okay? If you don't know what that means, don't worry about it. Happy to answer questions about it in the Q&A. But broadly speaking, a lot of these Sharia scholars have a problem with derivatives. And for those of you who are interested, some of this stems from a hadith, a saying attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, a saying or a deed attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, in which he said that you may not sell an unborn calf, you may not sell fish that are in the sea. So a fisherman can't say, or a fisher person can't say, I'm going to have this great catch next week. Want to pay me $500 for it? And that's actually what a lot of derivatives do, is you're paying for something that may happen in the future. But the idea here is it may not happen. Maybe you'll hit a storm. Maybe your ship will wreck. So it's not ethical, and it's not a good business idea to sell that fish in advance. Now, I've been talking a lot about Islamic finance in this abstract sense, but what is it? Well, the biggest component comprises Islamic banks. So these are banks that call themselves Islamic. Some examples, and I'll talk about them in a second, are like Dubai Islamic Bank, Abu Dhabi Islamic Bank. In Malaysia, there are a lot of conventional banks that have Islamic divisions, like Maybank Islamic or Hong Leong Islamic Bank. There are Islamic banks in the United States, not a lot, but a few. You can get things like an Islamic mortgage. If anyone wants one, let me know. I'll hook you up with Guidance Residential in Western Virginia. You can, maybe I'll take a cut. I'm sorry. No, that would not be Sharia compliant. Okay, so what kind of products can you get though? There's Islamic auto finance. Islamic auto finance is just like a regular auto loan, except it doesn't technically deal in interest and has some other conditions. You can get an Islamic credit card. How could you have a credit card that doesn't deal in interest? An interesting question. I'll take that in Q&A. You can get an Islamic mortgage. You can get Islamic quote bonds. Now I have to put quotes around them because they don't technically deal in interest. They are called sukuk, and they are actually asset-backed securities. For those of you finance geeks. You can deal in Islamic private equity. And there are even Islamic derivatives, even though I just finished telling you that for the most part, derivatives are off limits, right? So what happens is that these sort of Islamic financial engineers, they call themselves, come up with very sophisticated ways to reproduce a lot of financial products that exist in conventional sort of interest-bearing capitalist finance, but in ways that adhere to the rules I mentioned earlier, including avoiding interest. So like, why are we here? Is this even a big deal? Well, I mentioned $4 trillion, but that's just a number. As of the end of last year, total global Islamic financial assets about 4 trillion. How does that compare? Total global financial assets, right? The whole shebang, mostly conventional, 520 trillion. So we're talking about 0.75%. Now, I don't know, that might not sound like a lot, but it is as big as the financial sector in terms of assets of, say, Mexico. So it's a significant number, and it's also been growing very, very fast. Let's do some comparisons here. So it's a little smaller than the total financial assets of Mexico. It's about the size of the global hedge fund industry. You've probably heard of hedge funds. And it's bigger than the US Social Security Trust Fund, which, believe it or not, still exists. Okay. Now, where is Islamic finance? Well, there are 3 countries in the world that have officially Islamized their entire banking system. I'm going to talk about Sudan later this afternoon if you're interested. But for the most part, it's concentrated in countries where Islamic banks and Islamic financial institutions compete against conventional ones. It's kind of interesting. So Saudi Arabia, penetration is about 75%. Most of the banking sector is Islamic. Brunei, I'm looking at these really small letters, Brunei, Kuwait, very high, Mauritania, Malaysia at 33% has quite a large Islamic financial sector, especially if you consider the fact that only about 65% of Malaysians, maybe 70% of Malaysians are Muslim. But we do see a concentration in the Gulf countries, the Arab Gulf countries, in other parts of the Middle East and North Africa, and in Muslim-majority countries in Southeast Asia, especially in Malaysia. It's growing in Indonesia, very high in Brunei. But again, if you look at some of the countries at the bottom, you have presences in lots of places. South Africa, Afghanistan, Iraq, not just Muslim-majority countries, right? The United States. Germany in the 1990s, the German state of Saxony-Anhalt issued an Islamic bond. There have been legal attempts in Japan and Hong Kong to reform laws so that these regions can issue Islamic bonds. Why? Because they attract Muslim investors, some of whom are very wealthy, such as from the Gulf. So in a way, for some of these regions, Islamic finance is not just something for the population, but it's an on-ramp for capital, sort of pious capital, if you'd call it, especially from the Gulf states, places like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the UAE, Qatar. Now, what kind of companies participate? So I mentioned Islamic banks, 2 of the biggest in the world, the Al-Rajhi Bank in Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi Islamic Bank in the Emirates. But there are also a lot of big international financial institutions that you may have heard of, even if you've never heard of Islamic finance, like HSBC, a huge British bank. Deutsche Bank. In fact, Deutsche Bank, and I have that picture up there. Does anyone happen to know, well, does anyone know where this is?
Yeah.
This is the Kaaba in Mecca, the holiest site in Islam. Does anyone know what this building is?
Okay.
Yeah, it's got a lot of luxury apartments and some hotels as well. It's called the Mecca Clock Tower. It was built about a decade ago, very controversial, because some people said it's fantastic and it celebrates, you know, sort of this holy place. Other people said it's an eyesore, and why do we need luxury apartments right next to the holiest place in Islam? I'm not going to have an opinion on that, but Deutsche Bank, using Islamic finance, helped finance that building, right? So these the world's biggest banks are quite involved in Islamic finance. They've got divisions for it. Oops, what did I do? Okay. And this is Hongyong Islamic Bank in Malaysia, which I mentioned. Now, it was founded by a Chinese family who are not Muslim, but it has a large and thriving Islamic finance division. How fast has this grown? Well, fast, and faster than the financial sector in general, which has also grown really fast. So this is 2008 to 2021. This square is cumulative growth. So, right, the growth rate has declined. That's very common for any sort of early maturing industry. But still at 12.38% per year in 2021, that's gangbusters, right? Anything growing 12% a year in the financial sector, that's enviable. So the first Islamic bank in the world, the first for-profit Islamic bank in the world was Dubai Islamic Bank. It was founded in 1975 in, shocker, Dubai. But Islamic banking was really sort of, Islamic finance was kind of small potatoes until the late 1990s. And then oil prices shoot up again in the late 1990s, early 2000s. Some of you may be like me, you can remember that, some of you can't. And we have a real takeoff as these oil revenues kind of shunt their way into Islamic banking. This is also combined with global trends in financial engineering. which make it more possible for these Islamic financial institutions to come up with really clever ways to avoid interest, but offer sophisticated financial products. This growth, as this shows, continues to be quite strong and quite steady, even during the 2008 financial crisis when conventional financial assets dipped, Islamic ones did not. And some proponents of Islamic finance say that that's because Islamic finance had rules avoiding the riskiest derivatives, things like collateralized debt obligations, right? Some of the really funky, weird stuff that brought down Lehman Brothers and hurt AIG. The Sharia scholars were not comfortable with those, and therefore the Islamic banks were not invested in them, and therefore, the story goes, Islamic banking did better than conventional banking during the financial crisis. The growth rate has slowed, but that's normal. It's also possible that some of these big markets, the kind of home markets, like in the Gulf Cooperation Council, those are the rich Gulf, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman, Qatar, and the UAE, they're getting saturated. I showed you 75% in Saudi Arabia, right? Malaysia also may be getting saturated, but you're seeing really fast growth in a lot of other markets, like Indonesia, like Pakistan. Now, okay, who are these Sharia scholars? And what exactly is it that makes finance, Islamic finance, Islamic? In a practical sense, I would argue that what makes Islamic finance Islamic is that you have these people overseeing Islamic banks, Islamic financial institutions. These are the religious scholars that I was talking about before. These are some of the most famous ones in the world. As part of my research, I interviewed quite a few of them. And broadly, what they do is they check every instrument, every financial product sold by, say, a bank or a fund, and issue a fatwa, that is a judicial decision. It's like a letter saying, yep, this is in adherence with Islamic law. And then they sign it. And that means the bank can sell it and call it Islamic. Now, these people have many years of training, in some cases decades of training in Islamic law. The first Sharia board, the first Islamic bank in Dubai didn't have a Sharia board. And I interviewed the guy who founded it. He died a few years ago. And he said, no, I knew what was Sharia compliant. I knew what's Islamic and what wasn't. Why do I need these guys to tell me? They didn't know anything about banking anyway. But today, these folks, to be a successful Sharia scholar in the industry, you need to know a heck of a lot about banking. I was talking to Sheikh Dr. Mohammed Al-Ghadi from Saudi Arabia. I said, like, what's a typical day for you? I said, well, started by reading the Wall Street Journal. And then I usually go through like 3 or 4 dissertations written by, PhD students studying Islamic finance. And then I just spend my day going through legal texts and sign tons of fatwas. I go home and have dinner. Today, having a Sharia board like this, usually it's 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 people, to sign off on all your products is essentially what makes an Islamic financial institution Islamic. If you don't have that, in most countries where it's a big deal, by law, you cannot call yourself an Islamic financial institution. Now, there's some interesting things here. Who appoints these folks? So the Sharia board of Abu Dhabi Islamic Bank is appointed by Abu Dhabi Islamic Bank. Now, some people say, oh, wait, well, the regulator is appointed by the regulated. That's not cool. Other people say, well, you look at things like corporate boards, they're appointed by shareholders, they're elected by shareholders, so it's, right? There's a lot of complexity here. But I'm going to get into why this is complicated. Another better example probably is corporate auditors. Let's say you're a big corporation like, I don't know, Apple. Who audits your books? Usually it's one of the big 4 accounting firms like KPMG, PricewaterhouseCoopers. And who picks that firm? Apple. So these folks say, well, kind of the same deal. So these were the paradoxes I mentioned. Why is a $4 trillion Islamic finance industry, but not like a $4 trillion Hindu finance industry or Christian finance industry or whatever? Is there something really special about Islam? Is it uniquely compatible with modern finance? Now, I'm going to kind of skip over this part in the interest of time. To be sure, there are other fusions of religion and finance. Prosperity gospel is a mostly evangelical doctrine that says that if you contribute what's called seed money to your church, then it will come back to you manyfold, right? This is a common way in which many churches, particularly sort of large mega churches in the evangelical sphere, raise money. There are Christian and Jewish mutual funds, some of them explicitly saying we were inspired by Islamic mutual funds. And we avoid things like, depending on their doctrine, we may avoid investing in abortion-related services. Some of them avoid arms and so on. And of course, there are things like Catholic hospitals. You may not know this, I didn't, but there is an entire field called Buddhist economics, just like there's in Islamic economics. There are even entrepreneurship groups that have all kinds of religious orientations. And you can even go out, if you don't know this, I invite you to go to the local bookstore. There's like a whole section on evangelical investment advice, right? So there are all kinds of intertwinings of capitalist finance with religion. Islam doesn't have a monopoly on that, but it does stand out, right? Because of its size, because of its growth, geography, over 100 countries, probably more like 130 now, have some kind of Islamic financial institution presence, and all these different kinds of products. These institutions, as I said, will compete directly against conventional, that is sort of non-Islamic financial institutions, and they're very integrated into the infrastructure of modern capitalist finance. The same, they are regulated at the national level by central banks, or the National Securities Commission, right? The national equivalents of the SEC and the Fed. They are integrated with things like the World Bank and the IMF. I've been to multiple World Bank meetings about Islamic finance, right? And this is a picture of the UK, which in 2014 became the first non-Muslim majority country to issue a sovereign, at the national level, Islamic bond. And David Cameron, who at the time was the prime minister, was saying, we want London to be like Dubai and Kuala Lumpur. We want it to be the next Islamic financial capital. He said this. Now, the second paradox I mentioned, why do hundreds of millions of Muslims patronize Islamic finance when it openly simulates the economic effects of interest? Well, okay, I'm going to skip over this except to say, well, I won't skip over it, but briefly, what are some of the scriptural bases for Islamic finance? In the second chapter, Surah Al-Baqarah of the Holy Quran, verse 275 says, Halallahu al-bay'a wa harramu al-riba, which means God has permitted trade, but prohibited this thing called riba. I would sort of translate it in a historical sense as usury. Usury means an unethical form of lending. When we talk about usury today, mostly we're talking about, loan sharks. I'll lend you $100. You got to pay me back $1,000 next month, or you're going to have a little date with Louisville Slugger here, right? But for most of history, for most people in the world, usury meant a penny of interest. If I lent Professor Mabaya $100, and said, you need to pay me like $101 in a month, that was usury. And for example, Christian doctrine, the church said this was unacceptable. The Catholic Church actually never said it is acceptable, so it's still on the books, sort of. This has roots in Deuteronomy as well, right? Many Jews for a long time believed that you should not lend at interest to another Jew. This was one reason why they were forced by Christian rulers, in many cases in Europe, to become bankers, often against their will. Now, the Prophet Muhammad himself was a merchant. His first wife was a very successful merchant. He came from a family of merchants. And so the Prophet Muhammad left behind a whole series of sayings and deeds attributed to him, known as the hadith literature. And it includes all kinds of sort of commercial advice and rules. And, you know, I don't have time to get into this today, but we can think of this as sort of the architecture of a fair commercial system. It's things like, you know, if you're selling something, if there are traders coming to your city from a different city, don't meet them at the wall, you know, at the very outskirts of your city so that you can outsmart the other traders and then give them a really bad deal. Or things like don't sell someone a lemon, right? That is not a physical lemon, but a bad item like a car, right? If you know the engine on your car is broken, you got to tell that if you're selling it to someone. So we have this whole sort of scriptural basis for a moral economy, if you will. But I also, as someone who studies religion, I'm very opposed to the notion that we can sort of read from Scripture the way things are going to turn out. There are all kinds of things that are said in Scripture. Many of them have very little impact on our lives today. Now, in addition to this, though, in the 1960s and 1970s, there were intellectuals who said, look, actually going back even to the late 19th century, the intellectuals who said, look, in places like Egypt, Iraq, Indonesia, all over the Muslim majority world, people said, look, we are tired of imperialists, mostly European, imposing their financial systems on us. We feel it is a mode of extracting wealth and keeping us down. And therefore, we want our own financial system. And there were people who theorized a way to do that. Now, the way this was going to be done looked like this. It's a lot like, if you know what a mutual fund is or a private equity fund, it's a lot like that. What would an Islamic bank look like in this sort of utopian vision that they had? Well, an Islamic bank has money. You are a clever person with a clever idea. Like, let's say you came up with a really wonderful new way to make, I don't know, pizza. Okay? So then the bank will give you a bunch of money, let's say $100,000. You contribute your elbow grease, your labor power, and your expertise, and then you decide in advance if there are any profits, we're going to split them. Like, bank will keep 60%, the manager will keep 40%, or whatever. You can decide that, 70-30, whatever you want to do. But if there's a loss, then the manager bears it all. Now, this is basically the way stocks work. This is the way private equity funds work, right? It's an equity-based model. And the moral rationale was that if you have money, you should invest it and circulate it. And if you have great ideas, but don't have money, then it's good for everyone if you get access to that money, right? There were attempts to instantiate this kind of Islamic finance in the 1970s, right when it got started. But it hit some snags. One of the snags is that banks weren't used to doing this. What this means is you have to evaluate every manager that comes by. Because you know what? What if this manager says, I am going to make the world's greatest type of pizza? Thank you. And then disappears to Vegas and blows it all on roulette. Too bad. You can't do anything because the losses are borne by the bank. And so instead, some of the Sharia scholars endorsed a different way of doing Islamic finance, which looked like this. Let's say you want to buy a car that costs $20,000. And I'm Abu Dhabi Islamic Bank. You come to me and you say, I want to buy this Buick for $20,000. And I say, cool. I'll look at your credit history, or, you know, sort of like a regular bank would, your payment history. And I say, here's what we're going to do. I am going to buy the Buick from the car dealership for $20,000. I'm immediately going to sell it to you for $25,000, you, the customer. And you're going to pay me back installments over the next 5 years. You're going to give me $5,000 every year. Okay. Just think about that for a second. Let it stew in your head. Okay. So now the Islamic bank is acting as a trader. The Islamic bank buys a car for 20, sells it to you for 25, but you pay that back over the time. does that sound a lot like? An interest-bearing car loan, right? But some of the Sharia scholars who got involved with this industry early on said that's not interest. Because God has permitted trade, but prohibited usury, which they interpreted as even a penny of interest. And this is trade. Look, I'm a bank, I'm buying stuff, selling it for more money somewhere else. What's wrong with that? I'm allowed to buy 100 slices of 100 pizzas, and then you people are hungry. So I buy them for 10 bucks each, and I sell them to each of you for 12. What's wrong with that? I'm moving things around. Trade, right? So the fact that these Sharia scholars were able to endorse this, and again, not all of them, but a subset, allowed this industry to flourish and create a model in which the kind of utopian vision of an investment-based, equity-based sort of finance got replaced by what I call interest simulation. And if you look at the way actual Islamic banks operate, I mean, this is from 1992, it would be exactly the same today. If we look at their assets, we see that 98% of them are this kind of what I call interest simulation. It's to the point where Islamic banks, this is an Islamic bank in Malaysia. Well, actually, it's a bank, and it has its conventional division called CIMB, and it's got its Islamic division called CIMB Islamic. And what happens here is that there's a slight difference. CIMB has what are called interest rates, just like, you know, it's a regular bank. CIMB Islamic has profit rates. Why? Because when I bought that car as a trader for 20,000, sold it to you for 25, I made a profit of 5, right? That's not interest. So they're signaling to the customers that there's this difference. But if you look at the rates that you have to pay, essentially the prices, you may not be able to see this, but they are identical for different kinds of products. Now, some people are cynical about this. This is a comic by an Egyptian cartoonist. And it says, Al-Fa'ida 10%. So this guy is a conventional banker, and this guy is an Islamic banker. This says usurious bank, actually, and this says Islamic bank. This guy says 10% interest, Al-Fa'ida 10%. This says Al-Fa'ida 10% bidnillah. So this Islamic banker says 10% interest if God wills it. And you notice that he has a prayer bump, a beard, and he's holding prayer beads, right? So this is a very cynical take. And there are many Muslims who are cynical in this way, but there are many who are not. Now, the Sharia scholars, and I'm just going to close with this, some of them, look, this is a random poll called the Muslim 500 by a Jordanian think tank, which like ranks the 500 most important Muslims in the world. Obviously, this is absurdly subjective, but just for your informational purposes, 6 of the top 10 are Sharia scholars. They're experts in Islamic law, including some political leaders, right? Like Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran. Now, most of these, to be clear, are not very involved in Islamic finance, except Taqi Usmani, who is the sort of dawn of Islamic finance in Pakistan. And they became a name brand. And I'm going to close on this. There are many ways in which they're important. But one way, I interviewed someone in the UAE who said many of these customers, the customers of a bank, they see that some great scholars are sitting on a Sharia board and they trust them. Even my family members, when I tell them Sheikh Nizam Yaqoubi is sitting on our Sharia board, they get confidence. That's why the bank needs the top scholars. Or, as the most famous American Sharia scholar told me, Sheikh Yusuf Talal Di Lorenzo, hey, I'd rather have Tiger Woods endorse my product than some no-name golfer. Now, the interesting catch here is Sharia school, the most famous Sharia scholars can sit on dozens of Sharia boards, right? Each one for, say, one bank. And the most famous, in some cases, will make $200,000 or $300,000 for sitting on one board. So you do the math. The most prolific in the world, Sheikh Nizam Yaqoubi, whom I interviewed, in 2011, he was sitting on 85 boards. But you ask them and they say, wait a minute, I'm an expert, I'm a technician. I do this kind of technical work just like anyone else. CEOs get paid that much. The best lawyers get paid that much. Entrepreneurs get paid a lot more than that. So what's wrong with me applying my expertise in a very profitable industry and earning a living on it? And this has actually created a whole new career ladder for religious scholars. It used to be your choice, and I'll close with this. It used to be your choice was, maybe teach in a high school, teach religious law in high school, or be an imam, a preacher, if you had a degree in Islamic law. But today there's this new career path that's opened up. And today we also see things that's going beyond finance. We see things like Sharia compliant or halal cosmetics. We see Sharia compliant vaccines and biotech. And we see Sharia compliant travel and tourism, resorts, all kinds of things. So this Islamic economy, the Sharia compliant economy that is governed by Islamic law is expanding worldwide. Thank you.
Fantastic and engaging. We have time for about 3 or 4 questions. You make it very brief so we can get to as many as possible. Yes.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I wanted to ask that stocks were allowed, but I was wondering if the company issues bonds, does that like negate, like, then they're engaging in usury? Can you no longer invest in that company?
There are standards that but not dealing in alcohol or something. It just has a really high ratio. It has a high ratio of receivables. Again, for you finance geeks, a lot of issues. Moreover, you are a hotel. Most of your money comes from running people sleep in bed, but you also have a car. What if you are Emirates Airlines and most of your money comes from tickets, but you serve alcohol on flights? So the Sharia scholars develop all kinds of complicated standards, and they tend to justify them based on sort of the long 1400-year tradition of Islamic law, sometimes going back to statements attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, right? The Prophet Muhammad said that, you can use this kind of ratio in this kind of situation. We come up with very creative ways to apply them. Great question. Yes.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I think this was so exciting. I didn't know anything about it. But you mentioned that they don't charge interest. And from what you have said, it seems like it's a profit sharing, something around that. So I'm really curious, how do they make sure that foreign investors, people who are coming to this Islamic finance, get interested in that? And if the infrastructure is, for example, in non-Muslim countries, do they still have those standards, or is there any precautions that they follow?
Yeah, it's a really good question. One of the challenges is you need change. You need legal reform. The reason is this. Banks in most countries are not allowed to engage in like trading. If you are a bank, you are entrusted to people deposits, therefore you're not supposed to be like a card dealer. In that example I showed where the bank is buying and selling cards, all of a sudden the bank is a card dealer. Banking regulators have a real problem with that, as they should. So interestingly, what the Islamic banks do and what the legislation does is it says, okay, from a Sharia perspective, from the perspective of Islamic law, you can say they're a car dealer, that's cool. But from a regulatory perspective, what we might call secular law, you're actually feeling an interest. And so you don't have to be regulated like a car dealer. This comes up in cases also the kind of taxes you pay. In the UK, there's something called stamp tax, right? Which is, in any places, imagine sales tax, right? You don't want to pay sales tax on that car if you're like not really selling it. Right? All kinds of legal reform that have to go into allowing Islamic finance to flourish. And I should where a country where it is a big deal, it's not. And some of that is because in some governments have really gotten behind these legal reforms, often for political reasons. They see it as a way of appealing to kind of pious bourgeoisie, right? Sort of pious middle class and upper class constituencies. But in other countries, it's a way of attracting wealth capital. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question about the large development banks, like the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank. There's an Islamic Development Bank. So how does that differ? Are they operating differently? And how are they? Yeah, anyway, is that?
Yeah, great question. So, the MDB is, not surprisingly, it's development bank is the one by far the most involved in Islamic finance. Some of them have dabbled in it, in the ADB, African development in the World Bank. But the Islamic Development Bank played an important role in the birth of Islamic finance. Why? Because in the 1970s, all this oil money is flowing into the oil producing countries. It was the world history when oil prices went through the roof in 1973 and then 1978, 79. All of a sudden, these countries become absurdly rich. They become the richest country in the world. Kuwait is a good example. And they said, well, look, these bankers, it used to be like a sort of bias post for bankers from the UK. They'd be like one person dealing with the same rich families, but the same. And now the shoe is on the other foot. And all of a sudden in the 70s, you have these bankers flocking to Riyadh and to Dubai and to Kuwait from Frankfurt and New York and London saying, we want to do, and then the wealthy, sometimes billionaire Muslims saying, we want to do we want to do finance our way. We want banking our way. We've done it your way forever. And but no one knew exactly what that would mean. And the Islamic Development Bank declared that all financial transactions enacted by the bank had to be Sharia compliant. But even at the bank, people didn't really know what that meant. And so they sort of started developing a lot of rules, and those ended up becoming seminal to the development of the industry.
More question? Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. My question is that is the Islamic finance a concept that is commonly agreed by 100% of Islamic classes like Sunni, Shia, Sufi, and subclasses of like Sufis? Also, there is a Qadriya, Tijaniya, Naqshbandiya. All these subclasses are totally agreed with the Islamic finance, or there are some classes that reject the concept?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, there, I would say that among the large Sufi orders that you mentioned, like Qadriya and Naqshbandi and so on, they generally haven't taken sort of an official position, often because they are less, their distinctiveness has less to do with law. So if you are a member of the Qadriya in North Africa, right, the legal authorities tend to be Maliki, right? And so the divisions tend to go by the legal school, of which there are 5 major ones in the world today: Maliki, Hanbali, Hanafi, and Shafi'i, and the largest Shia school is Jafari. Now, is there Islamic finance involving all of them? Yes. But the vast majority of it is dominated by Sunni scholars. And Shia scholars are quite underrepresented for a number of reasons I'm happy to get into. Partly actually has to do with US sanctions against Iran. So Iran is sort of segregated even from the global financial system in general, which now includes the Islamic financial system.
I would ask the last question here. Maybe this is from my understanding of economics. I'll speak here because there is a feedback on the mic. So we know markets, financial markets, money is fungible. It moves, it searches where it's got, high interest. And we want to believe that the world is so interconnected now that money will always move where it gets highest interest. What firewalls and how tight is that firewall between Islamic financing and the rest of financing, especially when a bank is doing both on both sides? Can you comment on that a little bit?
Yeah. So let me start by saying that the picture I presented might have you feeling a bit cynical, but I actually argue in my book that there are real and substantively important differences between Islamic finance and conventional finance. I mentioned, for example, the 2008 financial crisis. There are also a number of other ones. I argue that Islamic finance actually instantiates a pre-modern, even an Aristotelian understanding of money and brings it into the present. And I also think that it sort of poses all kinds of interesting moral challenges to us. Why do we perhaps cringe, or some people cringe at the idea of a religious scholar making millions of dollars, but have no problem with, I don't know, a CEO making 10 times that? Now, to your question specifically, there have been efforts to kind of segregate Islamic finance from the rest of the economy. And in fact, that was the original vision. But today it is so tightly imbricated with conventional finance that it becomes difficult. I'll just give you one example. There was an attempt to create an Islamic version of LIBOR. So LIBOR doesn't really exist anymore, but it's a London interbank overnight rate, right? So it's basically like a global benchmark interest rate. And the idea was the Islamic one's going to be different from the conventional one. But the trouble is that they ended up really matching each other. You saw how the interest rates and the profit rates ended up being the same. Moreover, if one is much higher than the other, then anybody can arbitrage. Yeah. Because you don't have to be Muslim to invest in Islamic finance. You know, those of you who aren't Muslim, you can go to an Islamic bank, get a financing. So it's very, very hard. I will close with this by saying I interviewed an Islamic economist at Durham University who said, it's like two gears going in different directions. The global conventional capitalist economy is one going in this direction, and we're this little gear trying to go in the opposite direction, and it's really hard.
Ryan, thanks so much for your talk.
Thank you.
And the book is available, and it's a talk this afternoon. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much.